Arriving home early that evening, Alexander removed his shoes, placing them neatly by the door, and heard faint voices coming from the kitchen. He recognized them instantly: his wife, Victoria, and their daughter, Eliza. Smiling, he moved toward the kitchen, hoping to surprise them for a quiet family evening. However, the tone of their conversation made him stop just out of sight. "Mom," he heard Eliza say, her voice low yet brimming with excitement. "Wasn't that guy you were with last night amazing?" Alexander's heart skipped a beat. Who could they be talking about? Then Victoria's laughter filled the room, light and carefree, a sound he had once cherished but hadn't heard in a long time. "Oh, honey," she replied, her words punctuated by another laugh. "That Big Johnson you arranged last night was something else. He's talented in ways your father never could be. I want more of him." Alexander felt his face go cold as disbelief sank in. Victoria, his wife of nearly 30 years, was saying this, and their daughter had arranged it? Eliza's voice broke into his thoughts again. "I knew you'd love it, Mom. He's perfect for you, unlike Dad. I also want to see him again so bad. How about this weekend?" Alexander could almost picture Victoria's smile as she replied, "Perfect, sweetie. Your loser father's off on a business trip this weekend. Great timing." He felt his hands clench into fists, each word hitting him like a hammer. Part of him wanted to step away, to pretend he hadn't heard, but rage surged through him. With a barely contained fury, he took a steadying breath, stepped into the doorway, then without confronting them turned and walked away, their shocked faces burned into his memory. The door clicked shut behind him, echoing in the silence. He didn't need to look back, the betrayal was clear. And he knew one thing: this was just the beginning of what he had planned. Moving through the house in eerie calm that week, Alexander kept his expressions neutral, his actions routine, concealing the storm of thoughts beneath the surface. Each morning, he rose early as always, sitting down to a mechanical breakfast with Victoria and Eliza. He passed the toast and coffee with a faint smile, exchanging pleasantries as though nothing had happened. Every glance, every word was deliberate, intended to make them sense his presence, to feel the weight of silence creeping in. On Wednesday, Alexander lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. He noticed Victoria watching him from the corner of her eye as she sipped her coffee. "Alexander, you're up early," she remarked lightly, though he noticed a slight tremor in her voice. "Can't afford to slack off, can I?" he replied, his gaze on his cup. "Some of us need to be dependable." Victoria's hand faltered as she set down her cup, forcing a smile and looking away. For the first time, he saw her nervous. Soon after, Eliza joined them. Her usual confidence had waned, sensing the tension in the room. She glanced back and forth between her parents, trying to act casual, but her gaze kept flickering toward him. Alexander felt a grim satisfaction. "How's work?" Dad, Eliza asked, trying to sound casual. "Same as always," he replied, his tone steady. He looked at her directly. "Just doing my best to keep things steady here for the family." Eliza shifted in her seat, her eyes dropping. For once she seemed unsure. Good, Alexander thought. Let her stew in that discomfort. Later, his old friend Tom called, inviting him to lunch. Normally, Alexander would have declined due to work, but this time he accepted. It was time to further set the stage. Over lunch, Tom laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're one of the good ones, Alexander, always reliable, always looking out for your family. A lot of people could learn a thing or two from you." Alexander chuckled, though there was an edge in his tone. "You think so?" "Absolutely," Tom replied. "People don't realize how much work it takes to keep everything steady. Victoria's lucky to have you. You're like a rock." Alexander nodded, his mind racing. "Stability comes at a cost sometimes, Tom."
Tom looked at him, frowning. "Everything okay, Alexander?"
"Fine," he said with a faint smile. "Just realizing that not everyone values stability as much as I do." Tom looked at him curiously, but Alexander steered the conversation back to Tom's life. He knew Tom would likely mention this later to Victoria or to mutual friends. A small move, but every piece mattered. Back at home, Alexander's behavior became even more deliberate. In nearly unnoticeable ways, he began withdrawing, spending more time in his office, coming out only for meals. When Victoria tried to start a conversation, he replied briefly, observing her reactions. Each time he caught her watching him, he remained impassive, enjoying her growing unease. One evening, as they prepared dinner, he let a comment slip. As Victoria chopped vegetables, he stood close behind her and whispered, "Ever think about what loyalty means, Victoria?" She froze, knife hovering midair. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, giving her a mild smile. "Just a thought I had today. People talk a lot about loyalty, but I wonder how many actually live by it." Her face paled, and she quickly turned her attention back to chopping. "Loyalty's important, of course. I think everyone has flaws, though." "Do they?" he replied casually. "Some flaws are bigger than others." The tension was thick. Victoria fumbled, dropping a slice of tomato onto the floor, quickly bending to pick it up. Alexander noticed her hand shaking. It was satisfying, watching her unravel piece by piece. A similar discomfort grew with Eliza. When she tried making small talk, he replied with brief answers, his gaze steady and unyielding. She grew quieter, her responses subdued. By Friday, she could barely meet his eyes. The night before his supposed trip, Alexander sat across from Victoria and Eliza at dinner. After a moment's silence, he spoke. "Got plans for the weekend, you two?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Victoria swallowed, exchanging a glance with Eliza. "No, not really. Just planning a quiet weekend," she said, her tone controlled, though a hint of desperation lingered beneath her calm exterior. "Is that so?" Alexander replied, his eyes drifting between them. "You both seem to enjoy having time to yourselves, seems to give you a lot of freedom." Eliza looked up, startled, her eyes wide before she quickly cast her gaze down to her plate. Victoria managed a forced smile, but Alexander noted the fear in her eyes. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice wavering. "Oh, nothing," he said smoothly, picking up his glass. "Just an observation." The tension was palpable now, their discomfort almost tangible. Alexander felt a grim satisfaction seeing them both so uneasy, knowing they sensed something amiss but couldn't pinpoint it. He wanted them to experience the same dread he had felt the night he overheard them.
Later that night, as Victoria lay beside him, Alexander waited until her breathing slowed, signaling she had fallen asleep. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and went to his home office, where he had meticulously mapped out his plan. He pulled out a small notebook, reviewing the carefully outlined steps, each one crafted to leave nothing to chance.
The next morning, as he packed for his supposed business trip, Victoria entered the room, her face pale. She lingered in the doorway, watching him. "Alexander, do you really have to go this weekend?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," he replied, not even glancing her way. "Work doesn't wait." I just feel like," she stammered, struggling to find the right words. He paused, giving her a hard look. "What is it, Victoria?" She swallowed, dropping her gaze. "Nothing. Just take care, okay?" "Of course," he said calmly, his gaze lingering on her. "Wouldn't want anyone to worry about me, right?" She forced a weak smile, but he saw the fear in her eyes as he picked up his bag. Without another word, he nodded briefly and headed toward the door. Alexander didn't look back, allowing himself a final cold smile before quietly retreating to the guest room to wait and observe. The house was steeped in silence, heavy with the tension of what was about to unfold. He listened as Victoria and Eliza moved around, their voices low, filled with anticipation. It was only a matter of time now. Alexander sat in the shadows, watching the minutes pass, until finally, Victoria's voice drifted down the hallway. "Eliza, can you grab my bag?" she called out. "Got it, Mom," Eliza replied, her tone casual, almost excited. The lightness in her voice stung Alexander, his own daughter, fully engaged in this scheme with her mother. The voices grew louder as they approached, oblivious to his presence. Alexander waited until they were only a few steps away, then stepped forward, blocking their path. The effect was instant. Victoria and Eliza froze, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. Victoria's face drained of color, her hand clutching her bag tightly. "So," Alexander said, his voice cold, "and even you two had plans?" Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came. She cast a desperate glance at Eliza, who looked just as stunned, both of them caught like deer in headlights. "These plans that involve treating me like a fool," he continued, his gaze icy. "Explain yourselves." Finally, Victoria found her voice, though it trembled. "Alexander, it's not what you think. I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you have plenty of explanations," Victoria, he cut her off, his tone sharper and more accusing. Plenty of excuses. But I want to know why you and Eliza, my own daughter, chose to betray me like this. Eliza's defiant expression crumbled, her confidence fading as she looked down. She opened her mouth to say something, but Alexander cut her off before she could speak. Wasn't what, Eliza? His voice rose, slicing through the air. Wasn't real? Wasn't enough? Or wasn't disrespectful enough for you? Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and she dropped her bag, lifting a hand as if to reach out, but Alexander stepped back, his eyes fixed on her, unyielding. Alexander, please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. A mistake, he repeated, his tone thick with bitterness. A mistake is forgetting to lock the door. A mistake is misplacing your keys. This was calculated, planned, and you even used our daughter in it. His words were unrelenting, and Victoria seemed to shrink under their weight, her face contorting in pain. Eliza finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Dad, it's not that simple. It wasn't just. Not that simple. Alexander's voice escalated, incredulous and furious. Do you hear yourself, Eliza? Do you even grasp the pain you've both caused, the humiliation? Eliza's face crumpled, tears filling her eyes, and for a moment, Alexander thought he saw genuine regret. She tried to speak again, but only a choked sob escaped as she looked away, unable to face him. Victoria sank to her knees, clutching his hand, her grip desperate. Alexander, please. I'm begging you, forgive me. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please don't throw everything away. Alexander looked down at her, his expression hard as he pulled his hand free. Forgiveness, he asked, his tone cold and steady. After everything I've done for you, for this family, the sacrifices, the years of long hours, the vacations I skipped, the plans I canceled, and you tossed it all aside the moment you thought I wouldn't know. Victoria's tears fell, her hands clasped in front of her as though in prayer. Please, Alexander, I know I hurt you. I know I made a horrible mistake. But we can fix this. We can work through this. Just give me a chance to make it right. Alexander let out a harsh laugh. Make it right? You think you can mend this with a few words, with some shallow apology? You've shattered everything, Victoria. Everything, and you did it so casually, so thoughtlessly. Do you even understand what that feels like? Victoria's sobs shook her shoulders, her words a tangled mess of apologies. I know, Alexander, I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. I don't know what came over me. With a cold stare, Alexander replied, You want me back? Do you even think you deserve another chance? Eliza stepped forward, her face tear-streaked, her voice quivering. Dad, we're so sorry. I shouldn't have encouraged Mom. I don't know what I thought. I never meant to hurt you. Alexander looked at her, his disappointment unmistakable. You knew exactly what you were doing, Eliza. Don't pretend it was innocent. You and your mother made choices, and now you'll face the consequences. He turned back to Victoria. You're both adults. You knew the risks, and you went through with it, thinking I'd never find out. Was I really that much of a fool to you? No, never, Victoria sobbed, reaching out toward him again. Alexander, you've always been a wonderful husband. This was a terrible mistake, a lapse in judgment. You mean everything to me. I can't lose you. He shook his head slowly, the pain evident despite the hardened look on his face. Victoria, I thought you were my partner, my family. But now, I don't know who you are anymore. The silence that followed was stifling, each of them lost in their own turmoil. Finally, Alexander spoke, his tone laced with anger and finality. You both shattered something that can't be mended with words, and I'm done pretending that apologies will fix this. Eliza's voice came out as a barely audible whisper. Please, Dad. We'll do anything to make it up to you. Anything. Alexander looked at her with profound disappointment. The damage is done, Eliza. This isn't something a few tears and promises can erase. Victoria's face crumpled as she collapsed forward, her hands covering her face while she wept. Alexander, please. Please don't leave us like this. Unmoved, he stood there, feeling a cold detachment wash over him. He took one last look at the two women who had so easily destroyed his trust, then turned and walked to the door. As he left, their desperate sobs echoed through the house, but he didn't stop. This was just the beginning. His forgiveness had run out, and now it was time for consequences. In the days that followed, Alexander moved with purpose, severing every tie he had with Victoria and Eliza. His first step was the bank, where he closed all shared accounts, transferring the funds into an account under his name alone. He canceled Victoria's credit cards, restricted her access to his investments, and ensured that neither of them could access his finances. The next day he filed for divorce, instructing his lawyer to expedite the process. He was adamant that Victoria would receive no spousal support, and he cut off the financial aid he'd been providing for Eliza as well. They would have to figure things out independently, just as he was left to rebuild his life alone. Victoria was the first to feel the weight of his actions. Her credit card was declined as she tried to pay for groceries, her face flushing as she nervously tried another card, only to face another rejection. Embarrassed, she abandoned the groceries and left the store, barely noticing the cashier's sympathetic look as she hurried to her car. Once home, she frantically called Alexander, her voice shaking. "Alexander, my cards aren't working. I can't access any accounts. What's going on?" His tone was calm, almost too calm. "I told you there would be consequences, Victoria. Did you really think I'd keep supporting you after what you did?" She stammered, realizing the gravity of the situation. "But we've been married for almost 30 years. Don't you think you owe me something after all that time?" "Owe you?" Alexander's voice turned icy. "What I owed you, Victoria, was loyalty, respect, and love, and I gave you those until you decided they weren't enough. Now, you'll get exactly what you deserve, nothing." Her pleas turned frantic, but he simply ended the call, leaving her staring at her phone in disbelief. Eliza soon faced a harsh reality of her own. Accustomed to a comfortable life financed by her father, she suddenly found herself cut off, scrambling to cover rent and bills alone. She spent hours calling Alexander, leaving message after message, but he ignored everyone. In desperation, she finally showed up at his office, following him in despite his disapproving look. "Dad, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "You can't just cut me off like this. I've always relied on you." Alexander looked at her, a blend of disappointment and anger in his eyes. "Eliza, I gave you everything you ever needed, and what did you do with it? You encouraged your mother to betray me, mocked me behind my back. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" "But I'm your daughter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, okay? I didn't mean to hurt you." Alexander's expression remained firm. "A mistake is something small, something you apologize for. This was betrayal, Eliza. You made a choice, just like your mother, and now you'll live with it." He returned to his paperwork, signaling the conversation was over. "Dad, please," her voice broke, but he didn't look up. Finally, realizing the reality of her situation, she turned and walked out, her steps unsteady. In the following weeks, both Victoria and Eliza struggled. With no financial support and minimal job skills, Victoria was forced to find work, eventually securing a position as a cashier in a small store. The humiliation was constant. She could feel the judgment in the eyes of those around her, recognizing her as the woman who had once enjoyed a life of privilege but was now just scraping by. Her younger co-workers sometimes spoke down to her, assuming she was there out of necessity or for extra income. She held back her tears, knowing that speaking up would only make her feel worse. Every day, standing on her feet and scanning items, she couldn't escape the weight of regret. Eliza fared no better. With her college loans now in her name and no one to support her, she was forced to move out of her apartment and juggle multiple part-time jobs to survive. Once known for her confident, carefree demeanor, she now found herself exhausted, running between shifts at a coffee shop and waiting tables at a diner. The toll was physical and emotional. After a grueling double shift, Eliza would return to her tiny apartment, collapse onto her couch, and weep as the harsh reality of her life sank in alone, cut off from the father who had once been her constant support. Meanwhile, Alexander watched from a distance as their lives unraveled, his meticulously planned revenge taking effect. He felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by a lingering emptiness. For years, he had given everything to this family, his loyalty, energy, and time. He had thought that severing these ties would bring him peace, but instead, he was left with a hollow silence. He immersed himself in his daily routines, working longer hours and tackling projects that would once have drained him. Friends started noticing changes in him, often commenting on his quietness and resilience, praising him for not letting the betrayal break him. But none of them saw the inner conflict he carried, the sense of loss from being severed from the life he had built. One day, as Alexander was leaving the office, his friend Tom caught up to him, clapping a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Alexander, I know it's been rough, but you're free now. You can start fresh, rebuild with people who genuinely appreciate you." Alexander nodded, acknowledging Tom's words but not fully embracing them. The idea of a new life, untouched by betrayal and surrounded by people who truly valued him, was alluring. Yet it felt strange, almost intimidating. He had poured so much of himself into his family that he now questioned who he was without them. Meanwhile, Victoria and Eliza struggled to adjust to their new lives. Victoria tried calling Alexander a few more times, leaving lengthy, remorseful messages. She spoke of the good memories they'd shared, the love she still held for him, and her longing to make things right. Alexander would listen to the messages, his finger hovering over the delete button, his heart torn. He wondered if there was any part of him that could forgive or if reconciliation was even possible. But each time, the memories of betrayal and humiliation reignited his anger, and with a heavy sigh he would press delete, choosing to continue on alone. One evening, Alexander sat alone in his house, surrounded by memories of a life he once cherished. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the grief, acknowledging the sorrow that lingered despite his resolve. His revenge had been complete, but the price had been steep, and the silence that now filled his life felt almost oppressive. Gradually, though, he began to see a different future, one where he could form new connections and discover new purposes. The revenge he had carried out had left deep scars on everyone involved, but had also freed him from the weight of betrayal, giving him a chance to begin anew however uncertain the path might be. In the months that followed, Alexander's life became a mix of newfound freedom and lingering heartache. He threw himself into work, diving into projects that demanded his full attention, using the steady rhythm of routine to fill the void left by Victoria and Eliza. Yet, over time, even work couldn't entirely occupy his thoughts. A quiet yearning grew for something beyond revenge or solitude. One afternoon, during a rare lunch break at a small cafe near his office, Alexander noticed a familiar face at a nearby table. It was Josie, an old college friend he hadn't seen in years. She was reading, her hair tucked behind her ears, looking just as he remembered, thoughtful, warm, and grounded. "Josie," he said, approaching her table, unsure if she'd even recognize him after all this time. She looked up, her face breaking into a gentle smile. "Alexander." It's been ages. They shared a brief hug, the embrace warm yet familiar, as if no time had passed. Josie invited him to sit, and he accepted, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in months. As they caught up, her voice and laughter had a calming effect, and Alexander found himself smiling more freely than he had in a long time. She spoke about her work as an art history professor, her love for travel, and the little joys that filled her days. They reminisced about college, laughing at shared memories, and gradually the conversation turned more personal. So Josie began, sipping her coffee, her eyes observing him thoughtfully. "You seem different. Quieter. Is everything okay, Alexander?" The question lingered, and for a moment, Alexander hesitated. He had avoided talking about Victoria, even with close friends, but something in Josie's gentle gaze made him feel safe. Taking a deep breath, he began, his voice low. "It's been a rough year," he admitted. "Victoria and Eliza. I found out they'd been lying to me, betraying my trust in ways I never imagined." He clenched his jaw, suppressing the bitterness that threatened to rise. "It was a betrayal I never saw coming. I've spent months trying to make sense of it, trying to move on." Josie listened intently, her face softening with empathy as he shared his story. When he finished, she reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over his. "Alexander, I'm so sorry," she said gently. "Betrayal changes you. It makes you question everything you thought you knew." Her words resonated, and for the first time he felt understood, seen in his vulnerability. They sat in silence, the connection between them deepening. Over the following weeks, their meetings became regular. Lunches turned into dinners, and soon, Josie was a constant presence in his life. She was kind and insightful, and Alexander found himself opening up about parts of his past he had long buried. He told her about his childhood, his dreams, and the disappointments he had endured. Josie listened with genuine interest, offering her thoughts and support in a way that felt grounding. One evening, after a long walk through the city, they sat on a park bench overlooking the river as the sun set, casting a warm glow over the water. Alexander felt a peacefulness he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thank you, Josie," he said softly, breaking the silence. "For listening. for being here. I didn't think I could open up like this again." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "You've been through something painful, Alexander, but I believe there's more to you than just that pain. I see a strength in you, a kindness that wasn't broken by what happened." Her words touched something deep within him, and he looked down, his heart stirred by an emotion he hadn't felt in months: hope. The warmth in her gaze was unwavering, and he realized that her presence was slowly helping him heal. Being with Josie made him see that life could still be meaningful, could still offer happiness. Over time, their connection grew beyond friendship. Josie became his confidante, his source of solace, and slowly his heart began to open to the possibility of love once more. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner at his home, Josie set her fork down, looking at him thoughtfully. "Alexander, I need to ask you something," she said, her tone gentle but serious. He looked up, curious. "Anything?" "Do you think you're ready to let go of the anger? To fully move forward?" The question took him by surprise, and he paused, considering his answer. The anger had been his constant companion, fueling him through the months of fallout. But now, sitting here with Josie, he realized he was tired of holding on to it. It had served its purpose, but now it felt like a weight he no longer wished to bear. "I think I'm ready," he said slowly, the words surprising even him. "For the first time, I feel like I can leave it behind." Josie reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Then let it go, Alexander. Set yourself free from it. There's so much more waiting for you." Her words filled him with a sense of release, as though the chains he had carried were finally slipping away. He looked at her, warmth spreading through him, gratitude and affection welling up inside. That night, as they stood at the door to say goodbye, Alexander felt a surge of courage. Before he could second-guess himself, he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. Josie offered him a gentle, reassuring smile, her gaze full of warmth. "I'm here, Alexander," she murmured softly. "I'm not going anywhere." With those words, he felt a shift within himself, a new readiness to embrace whatever lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, Alexander and Josie's relationship flourished. They spent weekends discovering new places, sharing laughter, and finding happiness in each other's presence. Josie became a healing presence, gradually filling the emptiness left by betrayal. One afternoon, as they wandered through a local art museum, Josie paused in front of a landscape painting bursting with vibrant colors, a blend of light and shadow. She glanced at Alexander, a thoughtful expression on her face. "This painting reminds me of you," she said with a small smile. "Me?" he asked, amused. "How so?" She pointed to the bold strokes of light breaking through the dark hues. "It's the contrast. You've been through so much, but even in your darkest moments, you held on to something good. And now that light is beginning to break through again." He looked at the painting, seeing it in a new way, and felt a warmth bloom in his chest. Josie was right. He had faced the darkness, endured the betrayal, and now, with her by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. Leaving the museum hand in hand, Alexander realized that this was a new chapter, one where love, trust, and happiness were possible again. For the first time in ages, he felt truly at peace. Meanwhile, Victoria and Eliza had been thrust into a life far removed from the comfort they once knew. Their new apartment was small and cramped, in an area they would never have considered before. For Victoria, every detail was a reminder of how much she had lost. The paint on the walls was peeling, and a persistent draft seeped through old windows that rattled with every gust of wind. The warmth and luxury of her life with Alexander now felt like a distant memory, slipping further away with each passing day. Eliza, who used to boast about weekend shopping sprees in her brand-new car, now found herself working long shifts at a grocery store. She dreaded the endless hours, the demanding customers, and the aching in her feet each night. The harsh reality of their situation was more brutal than she had ever imagined, and as she lay on her uncomfortable mattress each night, she was haunted by a growing sense of regret. One evening, Victoria sat across from Eliza at the small, chipped dining table. She observed the shadows under her daughter's eyes and the fatigue that seemed to have aged her. This was far from the life Victoria had envisioned for them. "I think I need to talk to him," Victoria said, breaking the silence. "I don't know if he'll listen, but maybe there's still a chance he'll forgive us." Eliza looked at her, a blend of disbelief and bitterness in her expression. "Mom, do you really think Dad wants anything to do with us after everything? He's moved on. He doesn't need us." Victoria sighed, the weight of her choices pressing heavily on her. I have to try, Eliza, for both of us. Maybe I can make him understand how sorry I am. The next day, summoning all her courage, Victoria reached out to Alexander. Since the fallout, her calls and messages had gone unanswered. But today, perhaps out of curiosity or compassion, he agreed to meet her at a coffee shop they used to frequent, where they would once spend lazy Sundays laughing over pastries and discussing future plans. When she arrived, Alexander was already seated at a corner table, his expression calm and distant. He looked different, more self-assured, like a weight had been lifted. A pang of guilt struck Victoria as she realized her betrayal might have been the thing holding him back all along. She approached slowly, her voice unsteady as she greeted him. Alexander, thank you for agreeing to meet me. His eyes met hers, cold and unyielding. Let's keep this brief, Victoria. I'd like to get back to my life. His tone stung, but she forced herself to sit, clasping her hands nervously. I know I have no right to ask for anything after what I did. I made terrible mistakes. I was selfish, I see that now. Alexander nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. Mistakes? Is that how you see it, Victoria? You didn't just make mistakes, you tore our family apart. You betrayed me and dragged our daughter into it. Do you even realize what that felt like? Her eyes filled with tears as she looked down, unable to face him. I know, Alexander. I know I hurt you. I've thought about it every single day, about you, about what we had. Her voice barely a whisper, she added. I've lost everything, Alexander. He studied her, his expression hard. Did you expect anything different? You made choices, Victoria, choices that showed me exactly what I meant to you. And now, after destroying everything we built, you're here asking for forgiveness. She reached across the table, her hands trembling, but he didn't reciprocate. Alexander, please. I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were. I just want a chance to make it right, to prove that I can change. For the sake of the years we shared, the memories we made. His gaze grew colder as he withdrew his hand, crossing his arms. I won't deny we had good times, but those are memories now, nothing more. The woman I loved, the one I loved, the one I thought you were, she's gone. You made sure of that. Victoria's face crumpled, her voice breaking. So that's it? You're just going to walk away from everything we had? Alexander let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You already made that decision for me, Victoria. When you chose someone else and disrespected everything we'd built, you ended us. I'm here now to make sure you understand that this is your doing. She looked at him, his words sinking in. This was not the man who would easily forgive. His strength, his resolve to move forward, was undeniable. She could see it in his eyes. He had moved on while she remained trapped in the past. Alexander, can't you find it in your heart to forgive me, she whispered, desperation thick in her voice. He paused, weighing her words. Forgiveness, he echoed, as though testing the word. Forgiving you doesn't mean forgetting the past. Maybe someday I can forgive you, but trust? That's gone. I've moved on. I have a new life, and I won't risk my peace for someone who threw it all away. A tear slipped down Victoria's cheek, the full weight of her loss crashing over her. Alexander had indeed moved on, and there was nothing she could say to change that. Her choices had cost her everything, and now she would have to live with the consequences. So, there's nothing left to say. Then she managed, her voice barely audible. Alexander nodded, his expression calm and resolute. This conversation is over, Victoria. I hope you find what you're looking for, but as for me, I've found peace, and I'm not letting you disrupt that again. With that, he stood, his chair scraping quietly as he pushed it back. She watched him walk away, his posture firm, his steps certain, the man she had known now transformed into someone she could never reach again. As he walked away, a deep emptiness filled her, an ache she had never known. She had gambled with the one man who had genuinely loved her and lost him forever. Alexander, meanwhile, started anew with Josie, whose warmth and grounding presence brought him a peace he hadn't felt in years. Their early months together were quiet and unhurried, allowing them to rediscover what it meant to be valued and seen. They spent late nights sharing stories over coffee, laughing at old memories, even the painful ones. Through it all, Alexander felt himself gradually letting go, shedding the weight of past wounds.
One bright morning, they strolled through a nearby park, early sunlight filtering through trees and autumn leaves blanketing the ground in shades of orange and gold. Here, with Josie's hand in his, Alexander felt a peace he hadn't known in years. She looked over at him, her gaze soft. "I've seen you open up more these past few months," she said, "but I still feel like you're holding on to something. I can only imagine how hard it must have been."
Alexander paused, watching leaves scatter in the breeze. For a long time, I thought I'd never get past it. The betrayal felt like a weight I couldn't shake, only anger. He glanced at their hands, noticing how perfectly her fingers fit with his. "Then you came along. You reminded me that there's more to life than looking back." Josie squeezed his hand, smiling reassuringly. "You've already given so much of yourself. It's okay to have scars, Alexander, we all do. What matters is not letting them control you." His heart swelled with gratitude. In Josie, he'd found someone who didn't see him as broken but accepted him fully, past and all. Meanwhile, Victoria and Eliza adjusted to a life far removed from the one they once knew. The luxury and comfort had vanished, replaced by the harsh realities of making ends meet. Victoria now worked long shifts at a local diner, coming home late with aching feet and weary eyes. She had once been so absorbed in her desires that she never imagined life without Alexander's support. One evening, as she collapsed onto their worn couch, she glanced at Eliza, who sat cross-legged on the floor with a textbook. Eliza had enrolled in a night class, hoping to earn a degree in accounting and build a future for herself. Gone was the carefree daughter who had scoffed at hard work. "Eliza, do you ever wish we could go back?" Victoria asked in a barely audible voice. Eliza looked up, her face tense. "Go back? Of course I do, Mom. But what's the point? Dad's gone, and he's probably better off now. I can't blame him." Bitterness edged her voice as she turned away. "I hate this life, but we made our choices. I just hope I can build something better." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. It was as though she were seeing a stranger, her daughter, growing up in a way she hadn't prepared for. The privileged world they once knew was gone, leaving only the consequences of their actions. In Alexander's life, everything had shifted beyond his wildest dreams. One Friday evening, he and Josie hosted a small gathering at his apartment. Close friends and neighbors filled the space, and Alexander, once withdrawn and reclusive after the betrayal, found himself laughing and mingling with ease. The bitterness was gone, replaced by something lighter. As he moved through the room, refilling drinks and chatting, he felt Josie's gaze on him. He turned to find her smiling with pride. "You look like you're enjoying yourself," she said as he approached. Alexander grinned. "It's funny, just a year ago I would have never pictured hosting something like this. I thought my life was over. Now, it's like I'm finally finding myself again." Josie took his hand, her eyes filled with understanding. "You've come so far, Alexander, and I'm honored to be a part of this journey with you." As the night went on, Alexander felt a deep gratitude wash over him. He had once believed revenge would bring closure, but it had only intensified his pain. It was Josie's love and acceptance that finally allowed him to move forward. After the guests left, Alexander and Josie settled on the couch, gazing at the city lights twinkling beyond the window. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, feeling an unfamiliar peace. "Josie," he began quietly, "thank you. I don't think I would have found my way without you." She looked up at him, her smile soft. "You give me too much credit. You're the one who chose to let go, to heal. I just reminded you that you're not alone." They stayed that way, wrapped in each other's warmth, until late into the night. As Alexander drifted to sleep beside her, he felt a calmness settle over him, a true sense of closure. Across town, Victoria lay awake, staring at the ceiling in the dim light. She had lost everything, and for the first time she was beginning to comprehend the depth of her actions, the life she had discarded, the man she had taken for granted, the family she had fractured. All of it now seemed like a distant, bitter memory. The next morning, Alexander woke to the aroma of coffee and the sight of Josie moving about his kitchen, humming softly. He watched her, a smile spreading across his face as he realized he hadn't felt this content in years. Catching his gaze, Josie laughed. What she teased, handing him a mug. He shook his head, his voice warm with gratitude. "Nothing, I'm just grateful, that's all." She smiled, sitting beside him. "Well, I'm glad we're both lucky, Alexander, to have found each other when we did." He lifted his mug in a toast. To new beginnings they clinked cups, and as he took a sip of his coffee, Alexander felt a new optimism blossom within him. The pain and betrayal were still a part of him, scars he would carry, but they no longer defined him. He had moved forward, building something beautiful with someone who valued him and reminded him of his worth. Watching the sun rise over the city, Alexander knew he was finally free,